The morning I remember clearest from 31 years in the timber is not the morning a widowmaker came down out of a western larch and took the brim of my hard hat clean off my head without touching a single hair. It is not the morning a black bear walked through the middle of my landing and knocked over 3 cords of bucked logs like they were stacked kindling. It is a morning in late October of 1992, in the Yaak River drainage of Lincoln County, Montana, when I climbed down from the cab of my timberjack at first light and looked into the fog and counted 40 of them standing in the cut-over ground around my machine. I did not run. I could not explain that then, and I cannot explain it fully even now, but I did not run. I held still, and they held still, and the fog moved between us like smoke off a fire that had burned out during the night, and we looked at each other in the gray light until the sun rose enough to burn the mist off the ridge, and then one by one, slow and without any hurry, they walked back into the timber and were gone. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Roy Caudill. I am 72 years old, and I have lived in Lincoln County my entire life except for 2 years in the Army and 1 year in Bozeman, where I thought I might like to try construction work before I figured out that spending most of my day inside a city was not something I was built for. I came home to Troy in 1974, bought a used Caterpillar D6 from a man going out of business in Kalispell, and started contracting timber work in the Kootenai National Forest. For the next 3 decades, the woods were my office, my commute, and on most days my entire world. I am telling this story now because I am 72 years old, and Shirley is gone. And the people I might have worried about embarrassing are beyond embarrassment. And because I made a promise to myself on that October morning in 1992 that if I ever stopped working the timber and had time to think clearly about what had happened to me up there, I would find a way to say it. That time has come. Troy sits on the Kootenai River at the far western end of Lincoln County, a couple of miles from the Idaho border, and in 1974 it was a mill town in the way that mill towns are in the Northwest, which is to say the mill ran, the mill workers drove their trucks to the Kootenai bar on Friday nights, and the logging contractors kept their equipment in the gravel yards behind their houses and worried about diesel prices and the next year's timber sale schedule. The county was timber from end to end. Libby, to the east, had the big W.R. Grace vermiculite operation and several mills. Troy had its own mill. The whole drainage, from the Yaak River country in the northwest down to the Cabinet Mountains in the south, was working forest, and had been since before any of our families arrived here. The work I did was what they called gyppo logging, which means independent contracting. You are not an employee of any mill or company. You bid on timber sales on federal land. And if you win the contract, you go in and cut what the Forest Service marks, and you haul the logs to a mill and get paid by the board foot. The margins are thin, and the risk is entirely yours. If your equipment goes down at the wrong point in a contract, you eat the cost and the lost time both. If the weather closes the roads in October and you cannot finish a unit before the sale period expires, you can lose a season's work in a single week. Most gyppo loggers I knew carried more debt than a sensible man should carry and worked longer hours than a sensible man would. And most of them could not have told you why they kept doing it except that the alternative was working for someone else and following someone else's schedule, and that option was less acceptable to them than the debt and the hours combined. I had started with that D6 in 1974, traded up to my first Skidder in 1979, and by the time of this story, I had been running my own equipment on Kootenai National Forest timber sales for close to 20 years. I knew the Kootenai well by then, not the way a Forest Service ranger knows it, with maps and surveys and measurements, but the way a working man knows a landscape he has moved through in every season and in every kind of weather for 2 decades. I knew which drainages held water through August and which went dry by July. I knew which ridgelines the elk used for their fall movement and which roads would ice first in October. I knew the difference between second growth and old growth by the way the canopy changed the light and the way the ground felt under my boots. I knew which timber sale administrators I could trust to read a cruise accurately, and which ones I needed to walk myself before I committed. I knew the mill buyers and the haul road grades and the landing spots and the seasonal windows. That kind of knowledge is not something you can learn from a map or a book or a course of study. It accumulates the way calluses accumulate, through the repeated application of physical experience to a specific piece of the world. I was practical above all else. I want to be clear about the kind of man I was before October of 1992, because the kind of man you are before an event happens matters to what the event means. I believed in the evidence of my eyes and in the arithmetic of bored feet and in the feel of a well-maintained saw chain against Douglas fir. I was skeptical of things I could not measure or verify with my own hands, and I had no patience for the stories that circulate in logging camps and small-town bars about what people claim to have seen in the mountains. Every few years, somebody at the Dirty Shame Saloon in Yaak would get into a round of those stories, and I would finish my drink and go home. That was my orientation when I drove my rig up the Yaak River Road in early September of 1992, heading for a timber sale in the drainage above the West Fork.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. And let's get you back to the video.
My wife Shirley would tell you she was married to the timber more than she was married to me, and she would not have been wrong. When the mills were running, and the sales were coming, and the equipment held together, I could spend 60 hours a week in the field without thinking twice. That was the nature of the work. You did it while you could, because you never knew when a parts failure or a contract change or a shift in the Forest Service's harvest targets would pull you back. Shirley had made her peace with that before we married in 1975. She had grown up in a logging family herself, her father having been a timber faller in the Eureka area for most of his working life, and she understood that the timber does not accommodate a man's personal schedule. She was from Eureka, the other end of Lincoln County from Troy, and her people had been in the county since the 20s. She was rooted in that landscape the way old timber is rooted, and she had the patience of someone who understands that rootedness means accepting what the place is, not what you would prefer it to be. She died in 2019 of a cancer that moved faster than any of us expected, and I have been in Troy alone since then. And the house holds a quiet that a house where someone worked hard for 44 years should not hold. But that is what it is. I have the work and the memory of the work, and I have this story that I kept inside for 30 years, and telling it now feels like something I owe both of us. We had 2 children, both grown by the time of this story. Our son Dale had gone to Missoula for college and stayed, which is the trajectory of a lot of Lincoln County kids who get out and find that the world is large. Our daughter Gail had married a rancher in the Flathead Valley and was raising cattle south of Kalispell. By 1992, they were long since out of the house, and Shirley and I were living in Troy, in the same house we had bought in 1978. Our lives were simple and functional. I worked the timber. She ran the household and kept the books for the contracting operation, and every night I could make it home for supper I was there. On the nights I could not make it, which happened when a late push on a contract or a long-haul day stretched past the point where driving back made sense, I slept in the cab of the Peterbilt with a sleeping bag and a thermos and whatever sandwich Shirley had sent with me that morning. Shirley never complained about those nights. She had been married to the timber longer than she had been married to me, and she knew the difference between a man who chose the field over his family and a man who worked the field to provide for his family, and she had married the second kind. The sale I had won was a mix of western larch and grand fir with some Douglas fir on the south-facing slopes, spread across roughly 400 acres of mid-elevation ground on a ridgeline above the West Fork of the Yaak River. The Forest Service had put the sale together through the Troy Ranger District Office, and I had won the contract in a sealed bid process the previous June. The timber crews had looked reasonable. The ground was workable, and the haul road off Forest Road 68 was in passable shape after a grading pass in the spring. I had done 4 other sales on the Kootenai over the years, one of them in the Yaak drainage itself a decade earlier, and this one appeared on paper to be about as straightforward as National Forest logging gets. I drove in the first time on a Saturday in late August to walk the unit before I committed equipment. That is always my practice. You can study a cruise and a contour map for a week, but the map will not tell you that one of your primary skid trails runs through a seep that turns to bottomless muck in wet weather, or that the road shoulders on the switchbacks are softer than they look, or that the timber on the east-facing slopes has more wind throw than the crews acknowledged. You walk the ground yourself, in your boots, and you decide what you are actually dealing with. I spent 4 hours on that unit the first day, and came back to my truck with a solid enough picture of the lay to start planning in detail. The south end was as clean as the crews suggested. Open ground between the larch and good skidding angles down to the haul road. The north end was older and rougher, the timber bigger, the ground more broken, but still workable with the timberjack if I picked the skid trail routing carefully. The Yaak drainage in August smells like nowhere else in Montana. The moisture that pushes through from the Pacific keeps the ground and the trees wet enough that everything organic is constantly breaking down and building back up, and the result is a richness in the air that you either love from the first breath or find too heavy to work in. I loved it. The Yaak country has always had that quality for me. I had worked a sale in the drainage once a decade before and had felt it then, that particular density of the place, the way the trees were bigger and the understory denser, and the light that came through the canopy filtered through more layers of living material before it reached the ground than anywhere else I worked on the Kootenai. You could spend half a day on a unit in the Yaak and not hear a road or a saw or any sound from the outside world. Just the creek sound and the wind in the larch and the ravens working the ridge above you. I started moving equipment in the first week of September. My rig at that time was the timberjack grapple skidder and my old Peterbilt log truck. I also had a faller working for me on a day-rate basis, a man named Vern Bressler, who had been cutting timber since before I got out of the Army. Vern was 61 that fall and built like a fence post, thin but as tough as the timber he worked, and he had better instincts for a tree's lean and rot pockets than most men have for anything in their lives. He could read a 200-year-old western larch from 40 yards and tell you within a foot of where it was going to lie when it came down. And he was almost never wrong. Vern and I had worked 5 sales together without a serious disagreement. He had no interest in owning equipment, and I had no interest in running a chainsaw all day when I could be on the skidder. The arrangement suited both of us, and we had built a working rhythm that required almost no communication once a unit was set up because we each knew what the other was going to do before either of us did it. Vern showed up at the unit the first Monday of September at 5:40 in the morning, a full 20 minutes before I had expected him, with a thermos of coffee that he had made at the motel in Troy and a lunch packed by his wife, Bea. He walked the skid trail routing I had laid out during my weekend scouting and made 2 recommendations, both of which I followed because Vern's recommendations about the ground were always worth following. Then he started his saw and went uphill, and I started the skidder and went to work, and by the end of the first day we had a solid rhythm going and a respectable first deck at the landing. The plan was to start on the south end of the unit, where the larch was densest and the ground most accessible, and work north and uphill as the season progressed. We would finish the top of the ridge in late October or early November, weather permitting, and have everything hauled by Thanksgiving. In practice, timber work rarely follows plans with any precision, because the land has its own opinion about what should happen and when. But September was generous to us. The weather held through the whole month, cold mornings that warmed by mid-morning, dry enough that the skid trail surface stayed firm and the landing ground was solid. The western larch came down clean. The grand fir required more attention because of the irregular grain, and the Douglas fir on the south-facing slopes was as good timber as I had cut in the Kootenai. Vern and I worked efficiently, and we finished the south end of the unit a few days ahead of schedule. By the third week of September, I had noticed that the unit felt different on the north end than it did on the south. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I am not a man given to talking about feelings or atmospheres, and for most of my life I would have said that the idea of a place having an atmosphere was the kind of thing poets discussed when they had nothing useful to contribute. But there is a quality that experienced field men develop about the country they work in, a working knowledge built from thousands of days of close attention, and it tells you when the ground you are on is different from the ground you came from in some way that matters. In 23 years of working the Kootenai, I had stood in units that felt empty of everything except board feet, and I had stood in units that felt occupied, that had the quality of a room where someone was sitting just before you walked in. The north end of the Yaak unit had that quality from the first morning I worked it, and it did not diminish as the days passed. If anything, it deepened as Vern and I moved more of the operation up the slope. I did not say anything to Vern about it. There was nothing I could point to in specific terms. The bird and squirrel activity and what elk sign we were seeing were all normal for the area and the season. The weather was good. My skidder was running clean. There was no legitimate reason to describe a feeling to a man like Vern, who would have given me the same look I used to give people at the Dirty Shame who wanted to talk about what they had seen in the mountains. What I noticed first, in specific and measurable terms, was the ravens. Ravens in timbered country are part of the landscape the way trees and rocks are. You see them every day. They work the disturbance zones where logging operations expose soil and turn over debris, following skidders and fallers the way they follow tractors in a plowed field, picking up whatever gets turned up or killed in the machinery's path. I had worked around ravens my entire career and paid them about as much attention as I paid the wind. But in the second week of October, when Vern and I had moved to the northern part of the unit and I was setting up the main skid trail toward the ridge, I noticed that the ravens were not behaving in their normal working manner. They were not following the skidder. They were staying up in the standing timber on the perimeter of the cut-over ground, and they were watching in the wrong direction, not toward my machine, toward the timber behind me, up the slope, toward the ridge where the old growth got dense and the canopy closed overhead, and the ground between the trees stayed shadowed, even at midday. A raven watching the timber is not unusual in itself. Ravens watch everything. End quote. But 12 ravens in a line on a single standing larch at the cut's edge, all facing the same direction with that alert cocked head posture that means they have located a specific target, is not routine behavior. That is a response. That is the formation you see when a large predator has entered an area and the birds are tracking it from the air. I stopped my machine and sat in the cab for a few minutes and watched the direction the ravens were watching, and I saw nothing move. The timber was still and dark the way old timber gets in mid-October, when the larch needles are starting to turn from green to gold and the light has already gone flat. I sat there long enough to understand that the ravens were responding to something real, and that what they were responding to was not me. I told myself it was a grizzly working the ridge. Grizzly bears were not common in the Yaak in 1992, but they were not unheard of. The northern continental divide population had been recovering slowly through the 80s, and the drainage systems off the Purcell Mountains were starting to see animals moving through again from Canada. A bear working the ridge above my unit would explain the ravens exactly. I had watched ravens track bears before, staying above them at a distance and monitoring their movement. I filed the observation under grizzly and went back to skidding, but it kept happening. For 3 days running, every time I moved the skidder to the north end of the unit, the ravens arranged themselves in the standing timber and watched the ridge. And on the 4th day, the ravens went completely quiet when they would normally have been calling back and forth across the cutover, and the squirrels in the edge timber stopped their alarm chatter, and the forest went still in a way I had never heard it go still in 31 years of working in it. Not the ordinary midday quiet when things settle during the warmest part of the day. A different kind of quiet. A quality of held breath, as if the forest itself had paused to attend to something that required the full and undivided attention of every living thing in it. I had shut the skidder down to check a hydraulic fitting, and I sat in the cooling cab and listened to that silence for about 4 minutes before it started to lift again. Gradually, the way quiet lifts when whatever caused it has moved on. When I climbed out to check the fitting, I found a track in a mud pocket behind the right rear tire. I crouched beside it for a long time before I said anything to myself about what I was seeing. I am not a tracker by any formal training. I can identify elk, deer, bear, moose, and mountain lion from their prints because those are animals I have been around my whole working life, and their tracks are distinctive. What I was looking at was not any of those. It was a human-shaped footprint, bare, with 5 toes and a definite arch. And it was large enough that my own boot, which is a size 11, fit inside it with room on both sides and several inches to spare in length. The mud it was pressed into was deep enough that I could estimate some of the weight behind it. And whatever made that print was carrying a great deal more weight than any person I had ever worked beside on a timber operation. I measured it against my boot. I crouched there in the mud for several minutes, looking at the print and looking at the timber at the edge of the cutover, and then back at the print. Then I got back in my machine, drove down to the landing, went to work on the deck, and did not mention it to Vern when he came down the hill at noon. Some things, when they are too large to fit inside the categories you have for them, need time to be thought through before they are said out loud. I needed time. I want to describe the kind of thinking a working man does when an event happens to him that does not fit the structure of his experience. It is not the same thinking that happens in a classroom or a laboratory, where the process of encountering an anomaly and categorizing it is a recognized part of the work. For a gyppo logger in the Kootenai in 1992, there was no framework. There was what you knew from 30 years of working ground and watching weather and reading the behavior of timber country wildlife. And there was the thing you had just seen that did not fit any of those categories, and the space between them had to be bridged somehow. I had grown up in Lincoln County. My father had worked in the woods, and his father before him, and the stories that circulate in timber country about things in the mountains go back a long way before any of our families arrived here, back to the people who had been in the drainage for generations before the logging roads were cut. I had always placed those stories in the same category as ghost stories, worth hearing on a cold night with a drink in your hand, not worth carrying into your working life. Standing beside a track larger than my boot in the mud of a logging unit in the Yaak, I understood that categorization was going to require revision. I do not want to give the impression that I arrived quickly at any firm conclusion. I want to be honest about the length and the difficulty of that internal process, because the honest version of it matters more to me now than a clean narrative would. For several days after finding the track, I moved through the ordinary business of the timber operation while carrying, alongside the hydraulic pressures and board foot calculations and the condition of the skid trail surface, a question I had no good instrument for measuring. I had seen a track. The track was real, pressed in real mud, with real dimensions I had measured with my own body. Whatever made it existed in the physical world. It weighed something and walked on 2 feet, and had been standing within 50 feet of my machine while I worked. That was the beginning of what I knew. The beginning is not the same as the whole of it. What I kept returning to, in the quiet hours of the drive home and the early mornings before I left Troy, was the behavior. Animals leave tracks because they pass through an area. The tracks I had found were not the tracks of an animal passing through. The track behind the rear tire of my skidder was not the footprint of something crossing a drainage. It was the footprint of something that had come to the skidder and stood there and watched what the skidder was doing, and then walked away. The distance between those two things, between an animal passing through and an intelligence taking an interest, was the distance I spent those early mornings trying to cross. By the end of the first week, I had arrived at a provisional position. I was willing to accept that I was not alone in the north end of the unit, that whatever was sharing the drainage with me was paying close attention to my operation, and that it had not been threatening in any observable way. That was enough to work with. I did not need more certainty than that to continue the operation, and I did not need more certainty than that to decide to pay back attention in return. The exchange at the lunchbox that began the following week was a natural extension of that decision. I was not trying to establish contact with something I understood. I was behaving consistently and non-aggressively towards something that appeared to be observing my consistency and my aggressiveness or lack of it. The food I left was not bait. It was an extension of the same logic that makes you not look directly at a wild thing that has not yet decided whether to run. You make yourself predictable. You give the situation room to develop at its own pace. If that calculus turned out to be entirely wrong and the food was simply being taken by a clever black bear, the cost was a few apples and some jerky. But the plant material left in return was not something a black bear does, and I was not going to pretend otherwise to myself in the privacy of my own truck at 2 p.m. That was a Friday. Over the weekend, I drove back to the unit alone on Saturday afternoon, telling Shirley I needed to check the Skidder's hydraulic system and could be back by supper. I walked from the Skidder's last position to the area where I had found the print, and I found 2 more. One was in the soft soil at the edge of the skid trail, facing uphill, pressed deep and clear. The second was in a moss-covered flat near the small creek that ran through the north end of the unit, and this one was the clearest yet. The toes were fully defined. The ball of the foot was wider relative to the length than any human foot I could compare it to. The stride between the 2 prints was longer than any stride I could manage at full extension. And, when I put my own foot beside the creek print, the size difference was enough to give me a feeling in my chest that had no name I could locate. I followed the prints for about 200 yards upslope, to the point where the ground got rocky and hard and gave no more impressions. Then I stopped and stood in the timber and felt the quality of the forest around me change. Subtly but clearly, as if my presence there had been registered by something that was not visible to me. I did not hear anything that should not have been there. I did not see anything move. But the attention I felt directed at me from somewhere uphill was as real as the track itself had been, and I am not a man who imagines such things. I turned around and walked back to my truck. I did not tell Shirley what I had found. I told her the hydraulic fitting was fine, and the unit was running ahead of schedule, and I thought we might finish early if the weather held. She served supper and we watched the news and went to bed, and I lay awake for a couple of hours thinking about a track in the mud that was bigger than my boot by several inches on every side. In the days that followed, I began paying attention to the north end of the unit differently. Not with alarm, but with precision. I was treating it the way I treat a piece of equipment that has started making an unfamiliar sound. You do not ignore it and hope it resolves. You listen to it carefully and you try to understand what it is telling you, because that information is useful, and the alternative to having it is worse. What I started seeing, once I was looking in the right way, was a pattern in the behavior of almost every animal that moved through that north end. The elk that had been coming down to the creek in the early mornings were still coming, but from a different direction, avoiding the upper part of the drainage the way animals avoid a predator's established range. The white-tailed deer I had been seeing near the timber edge at dusk were not appearing in the northwest corner of the unit anymore, though they were still showing along the south and east edges. The ravens that had been watching the ridge would occasionally flush off a snag top in a single collective burst and circle before landing again further up the slope, still facing the same direction. Whatever they were tracking had moved, and there was the smell. It had been there from early October. I was certain of that in retrospect. But in a working timber operation, the air carries diesel exhaust and bar oil and sawdust, and the sharp resin of cut wood, and a background smell that matched none of those things might not register against that baseline until you knew to look for it. When the wind shifted one afternoon and came directly from the north end of the unit into my cab window, I smelled something that stopped me as completely as if someone had hit a switch, heavy and organic and animal in its depth, but with a component that had no animal equivalent in my experience. The closest description I can offer is to say it was the smell of a very large, warm body combined with the smell of deep forest soil after several days of rain, but both of those things amplified beyond what you would expect from either alone. Not unpleasant, not foul, dense and overwhelming enough that my eyes watered and my chest felt tight for a few seconds before the wind shifted back. I smelled it twice more that week. Each time, the ravens went still, and the forest went quiet in the same way, and each time I sat motionless in the cab without having made any conscious decision to do so. There is a response that happens in the body when it detects a presence the mind has not yet fully processed, something that operates below thought, and I was experiencing that response on the north end of the Yaak unit without having a framework for what I was responding to. Through the second week of October, the signs continued. I found a tree structure near the creek on the north end. 3 young saplings bent into an arch formation. Their root ends still in the ground. Their tops interlocked at about 8 feet of height. I had seen photographs of formations like this before and had always assumed they were wind damage or coincidental growth. Standing in front of this one, in the Yaak timber, in the context of everything else I had been seeing, I understood that the assumption was wrong. The saplings were green, and their bending was recent. The arc of the interlocked tops was too regular and too consistent to be the product of random force. Whatever had bent those saplings had done it intentionally, and it had the strength to bend a 4-inch green sapling nearly in half without snapping it at the base. I did not bring Vern to look at it. I was not ready to share it, and I was not certain that sharing it would accomplish anything except putting an idea into the conversation that I could not then take back out. The following week I found 2 more structures, both in the northwest part of the unit where the ground dropped toward the creek and the timber got oldest. One was similar to the first, saplings bent and interlocked into an arch. The second was different, a cluster of dead limbs arranged on the ground in a pattern that was too ordered and precise to be random, roughly parallel and evenly spaced, like a floor laid down in a place where someone slept. I stood beside that second structure for a long time. The spacing between the limbs was consistent. The limbs had been selected by size, with larger ones on the outside and smaller ones toward the center, and the largest of them weighed enough that I would have needed both hands to place them. Whatever had made this arrangement had done it with intention and with strength, and it had been done recently enough that the cut ends of the limbs were still bright. Around this same time, I started leaving my lunchbox outside the cab during the midday break. I do not know exactly why I started doing this. It felt, when I examined it, like a concession to the situation, an acknowledgement that whatever was watching me was intelligent enough to observe what I did throughout the day, and leaving food visible felt like a form of honesty about my intentions. I was there to cut timber, not to hunt, not to disturb more than the sale required. On the second day, I left the box out. One of the apples I had brought was gone when I came back from checking a turn I had left on the slope. The box had not been knocked over. No bird or ground squirrel had been at it. The apple simply was not there. Whatever took it moved without leaving any trace beyond the absence itself. I replaced the apple the next morning. That one was gone by midday. The third day, I left 2 apples and a piece of jerky, all of it gone, and in its place, beside the lunchbox, was a flat stone with a shallow depression worn into its center and a piece of dried plant material pressed into the depression. I picked it up. Medicinal smell I could not place. I put it in my shirt pocket. When I got home that night, I showed it to Shirley. She turned it over in her fingers and smelled it and said she thought it might be yarrow, common enough in the Montana highlands. But she said the drying and pressing had been done with care and precision, not something that occurs on its own in the open air. She asked me where I found it. I told her in the unit. She gave me a look that meant she knew there was more to the story, and she let it pass. For the following week, the exchange continued. Each morning I left something near the lunchbox, apples or dried fruit or once a pack of smoked salmon I had picked up in Troy. Each afternoon when I returned from a turn, whatever I had left was gone, and something had been left in return. Twice more it was plant material, dried and pressed into that same stone's depression. Once it was a handful of small dark berries that I could not identify, but that Shirley said, when I brought them home without explaining where they came from, looked like they might be service berries, though she said the color was wrong for October. Once it was a length of inner bark stripped from a tree I could not identify, twisted into a loose braid. I kept all of these things in a cloth bag in the cab of the Peterbilt, and I did not talk about them with anyone. By the third week of October, I had enough accumulated information to know that something was sharing that drainage with me, and that it was not a grizzly bear or any other animal I could account for. I also knew that I had not been threatened. Whatever was up on that ridge had been aware of my presence since the beginning of the operation and had done nothing to drive me out or confront me. It had simply stayed at a distance and watched, and it had begun, through the exchange at the lunchbox, to initiate a kind of contact. The tree structures and the plant material and the careful attention did not feel like warning signs. They felt like patience, like an intelligence that was allowing the relationship to develop at its own pace, without forcing anything faster. I had 3 or 4 weeks left in the unit. I decided to go up the ridge at night. I want to be honest about the practical justification I gave myself for this decision and what the actual reason was. The practical justification was that I needed to move the skidder to a new position before the morning so I could make a head start on a difficult section of the north slope. This was true. The actual reason was that something in me had been drawn to that north end of the unit since the first morning I walked it. In a way I had not felt about a stretch of timber since I was a young man on my first solo contract. I wanted to see it. I wanted to understand what was in that drainage. That is not a professional reason. It is just the truth. I told Shirley I needed to move the skidder to a new position before morning. I left the house at a few minutes past midnight, drove the hour to the unit, and parked my truck at the landing. The timberjack was sitting where I had left it at the end of the previous workday, at the upper end of the main skid trail, about a quarter mile from where the trail bent northwest toward the oldest timber on the sale. The night was just below freezing and the sky was clear. There was a half moon, which gave enough light across the open, cut-over ground to walk without a headlamp, though I used mine in the timber. I had my steel in one hand and my thermos in the other. I climbed the skid trail toward the skidder, my boots on the frozen mud making more noise than I wanted them to. When I reached the machine, I started it, moved it about 100 yards forward to the position I wanted for the morning, then shut it down and sat in the cab with the heater running, drinking coffee and listening to the night. The forest at night in October in the Yaak is not quiet. The cold settles the canopy, and the dry larch needles tick against each other in any movement of air, and small animals work the deadfall on the forest floor. Owls move between the snags on the ridge. The creek sound rises as the daytime noise drops away, so that by midnight you can hear the water from twice as far as you can in the afternoon. The north end of the unit had a quality of attentive stillness I had come to recognize over the past weeks, and it was present that night in a form I had not encountered before. Heavier and more specific, as if the attention that had been directed at my machine during the working days had been concentrated and brought close. After about 10 minutes, I switched off the cab light and the heater and sat in the dark. 20 minutes after I killed the heater, I heard the first sound from the ridge. It was what I had been hearing at the edges of the working day for several weeks, the deep, low vocalization I had been filing in my head as possibly elk. But this time it was closer, and it was coming from the northeast, from the direction of the old Snag field, where the previous logging operation in the 60s had left a section of broken and standing dead timber that the current sale had not included. That section was about 300 yards from my machine. The sound lasted about 8 seconds. Then silence. Then a second sound from a different direction, uphill and to the west. Then a third from the ridge directly above the unit, answering both of them. 3 sources, 3 distinct positions. The calls went back and forth for several minutes, overlapping occasionally, shifting in pitch in ways I began to hear, as distinct from each other, the way you start to hear individual instruments in music once you listen long enough to know what to listen for. And then, from the northeast, from the direction of the old Snag field, I heard a different sound. Higher pitch, shorter duration, repeated several times in quick succession with an urgency in it that was nothing like the lower calls. And underneath that urgency, a physical sound that was not a vocalization at all. Metal against wood, irregular, the sound of something straining against a fixed resistance, pulling and stopping and pulling again. I sat with that for about 30 seconds before I understood what I was hearing. Then I got out of the cab. I know what the rational response to that situation is. The rational response is to stay in the cab, because whatever is making that sound in a dark forest at 2 in the morning is not something you approach without knowing what it is. I have worked around bear and mountain lion my entire career, and I know the first rule of night encounters with large animals in timber country, which is that you do not go looking for them in the dark. But the distress sound from the northeast had that higher pitch I had been tracking for several weeks, the one that sounded different from the lower calls, and something in my body recognized the difference before my mind did. I walked toward it. The Snag field was 200 yards from the Skidder. I crossed the skid trail, pushed through a stretch of heavy deadfall and exposed root systems from a blowdown, and then entered the open area where the old growth had been cut in 1964, and the snags that had not been felled then had been standing dead for close to 30 years. Western larch can stand as snags for 30 or 40 years before they rot through completely, and in the moonlight their pale bark-stripped trunks rose out of the ground like pillars from a structure older than any road in Lincoln County. The moonlight lay flat across the open ground between the snags, and in the shadows between the trunks the darkness was complete. I was moving carefully because of the deadfall, using my headlamp, and the light on the aluminum white trunks of the dead larch made the whole field look like a place I had never been in 31 years of working this country. The distress sound was coming from the northeast end of the Snag field, where the largest of the old standing larch grew, a trunk 4 feet through at the base. I could hear the metal sound more clearly as I got closer, a strained and irregular rhythm in short bursts. Something alive pulling against something fixed, and I smelled it before I got around the last fallen trunk. That heavy, complex smell, but with something new underneath it. A sharper note I associated without thinking with pain and with fear, with the particular chemical of something that is caught and knows it. Then I moved around the fallen trunk and my headlamp found what was there, and I stopped. I held still for probably 30 seconds. I could not move, and I could not look away. It was young. That was the first thing I understood, because of how it held its body and moved in the distress it was in, the way young things do when they are caught and cannot free themselves. It was tall, even so, well above 6 feet, with broad shoulders and long arms and dense hair covering its body that was dark enough in the white beam of my headlamp that I could not determine the color. It was on the ground at the base of the large snag, one forearm extended toward the cable that was anchoring it, and I could see the loop of old wire rope around its wrist, the cable biting into the skin above the wrist joint, where the repeated pulling and struggling had drawn it tight. The other end of the wire ran to the base of the snag, where the old choker cable from the 1960s cable logging operation had corroded and been buried under decades of duff and had been exposed by the rains and frost heaves of early October. The cable ran along the base of the dead larch like a buried root, and this young one had gotten its arm into the exposed loop, and in struggling to free itself had tightened the noose until the cable was cutting into the skin and the wrist had swollen around it. It turned and looked at me. The face stopped me where the size and the hair had not. The brow was heavy, and the eyes were deep-set and wide-spaced, and in the beam of my headlamp they reflected back a reddish gold that was nothing like the flat-eye shine of a deer or the green glow of a bear caught in a light at night. They were eyes that were looking at me and evaluating me and feeling something I understood clearly and without question as terror. And the understanding of that terror was what unfroze my legs. I took one step toward it, and it yanked backward against the cable and made a short, sharp sound that was nothing like the calls from the ridge and everything like pain. I stopped immediately. I held both hands up, palms out, which was a gesture my body produced without my mind deciding to produce it. Then I crouched down slowly, lowering my height below its height, and I held still. We stayed in that arrangement for what felt like several minutes, but was probably closer to 45 seconds. The sounds from the ridge had changed in character. The longer, lower calls were closer now, faster and more complex, and I could see from the way the young one's body responded, turning toward those sounds, and then back to me, and then toward the sounds again, that it was communicating with the others. Whether that communication included information about me or was simply the broadcasting of distress, I had no way of knowing. But the others were coming, and they were coming quickly. I had perhaps 15 minutes. I looked at the wire rope around the wrist, and I looked at the style in my right hand, where I had been carrying it since I left the skidder. A chainsaw run through wire rope destroys the chain, and I had a spare chain in the toolbox on the machine. The alternative was leaving this young one caught until whatever was descending from the ridge arrived, which might have been a workable option if the wrist around the cable were not already in trouble. The swelling was significant. The color of the skin visible above and below the cable was not right. The young one had been in that cable for long enough that the situation was serious, and the wrist did not have unlimited time. I needed to cut the anchor, not the cable at the wrist. The wire ran from the wrist loop to the base of the snag, about 12 feet of old rusted choker line corroded into the bark of the dead larch. The end wrapped several times around the trunk and fused to itself with 30 years of oxidation. If I cut the snag above the cable anchor, the upper trunk would fall away from the fixed point and give me enough slack to work the loop off the wrist. That was the decision. It was the only one that made sense in the time I had. I stood up slowly, kept both hands visible, and moved around to the far side of the snag from where the young one was sitting, at an angle where it could still see what I was doing. I wanted it to watch me cut the tree, not something else. I set the bar of the saw against the larch trunk about 18 inches above the ground, above where the cable wrapped around the base, and I pulled the cord. The sound of a chainsaw at 2 in the morning in a silent forest is not a small event. The young one jerked backward against the cable and made the pain sound again, and I paused with the saw at idle and held my free hand toward it, palm out, and waited. It looked at me with those reflective eyes and made a short, low sound with a questioning rise at the end, and I had nothing to offer in response except to point the saw at the tree and keep my body in its sight line. After a few seconds it settled back. I set the bar against the trunk and cut. Western larch snag wood at close to 30 years dead is dry, but still harder than pine. The saw worked through it in just under a minute. When the cut completed, the upper section of the snag shifted away from the base with a crack, and the cable that had been anchored there went slack, dropping to the ground with 8 feet of play between the loop on the wrist and the severed anchor point. I set the saw down and moved toward the young one slowly, crouching as I came, keeping my hands visible at all times. The loop around the wrist had tightened enough that working it off was not simply a matter of sliding it free. The swelling had closed the gap between cable and skin to almost nothing. I needed to find the ferrule, the eye at the end of the old choker, and work the cable back through it to open the loop. This required getting my hands right next to the wrist, within inches of the skin. I got within arm's reach and stopped. It watched me. The fear smell was still present, but something else had arrived underneath it that was different enough from pure fear that I noticed the change. I reached out slowly and got my fingers on the cable close to the wrist, not on the wrist itself, and I felt the young one tense entirely, but not pull away. I worked my fingers toward the ferrule and found it. The cable had stiffened with corrosion, and the ferrule had deformed enough over the decades that the wire had to be bent at an angle I could barely manage with 2 hands. I worked on it for close to 10 minutes. The calls from the ridge were very close by the end of those 10 minutes, loud enough that I could feel the lower ones in my sternum, and the young one was making sounds in response that had dropped the note of pure distress and taken on something more like exchange, call and response. A continuing conversation. The ferrule gave. The loop opened. I held the cable away from the wrist and the young one pulled its arm back, and then it was free. It sat for a moment looking at its wrist, turning it over, examining the skin where the cable had been. Then it looked at me. It held that look for longer than most moments I have experienced in my life. A moment with weight and specificity in it. A communication in a language I did not have words for. And then it stood up. Standing. It was taller than I had estimated from the ground. The top of its head was well above my own at 6 feet 2, and the shoulders, even on a young one, were wider than anything I had a clear comparison for. It looked at me for that last long moment, and then it turned and moved into the timber at a speed that covered ground faster than anyone I have ever seen move on 2 legs over rough terrain in the dark. Within seconds, the sound of it was gone. I stood in the snag field with my dead saw on the ground beside me and my hands at my sides, listening to the calls from the ridge go through a rapid change in pattern, rising and then falling and then shifting into something softer and more complex. And then the forest, which had been full of sound for the past half hour, began to go quiet. Not the alarmed quiet I had come to recognize over the past weeks. A different kind of quiet. The quiet that follows when something that needed to happen has happened and the tension has released. I picked up my saw. I walked back to the skidder, got in the cab, and sat there with the dead engine and my cold thermos and tried to understand what I had done in the past 20 minutes and what it was going to mean for the rest of the night. I fell asleep in the cab. When I came back up out of sleep, the sky to the east above the cutover ground had gone from black to the color of old pewter, and the fog that had come up the Yaak Valley during the night was lying across the skid trail and the open ground in a layer that reached roughly to knee height, pale and flat in the early light. I sat up and rubbed my face and reached for the thermos out of habit. Then I looked through the windshield at the fog and the timber edge, and I went entirely still. They were there. 40 of them, or close enough to 40 that I could not finish a reliable count before the fog shifted and rearranged my sight lines. Standing in the brush in the open ground and along the timber edge on both sides of the skid trail, arranged around my machine in a rough arc that extended from one side of the cutover to the other. Some of them were close enough that I could make out their shapes clearly through the glass and through the fog, close enough that I could see their breath in the cold morning air. Others were back in the mist far enough that I could see only their outlines against the standing timber behind them. Every one of them was still, and every one of them was watching the cab. I did not reach for the door handle. I did not reach for anything. I sat with my cold thermos in both hands and looked out through the windshield at the most impossible thing I had encountered in 31 years of working timber. And I tried to find an appropriate response, and I could not find one. So I sat and I watched, and they stood in the fog, and they watched me, and the sky slowly brightened around all of us, and I began to understand that the stillness they were holding was not threatening. It was a specific kind of stillness, the kind that carries weight, but not aggression, the kind that says, I see you, and I remember what you did, and I am here because of what you did, and I need you to understand that. None of them had moved toward the machine. None of them had made a sound I could hear through the glass. They were simply there, the way the timber is there, present and enormous, and requiring nothing of me except that I acknowledge what I was looking at. I acknowledged it. The first movement any of them made came from the one standing closest to the cab, about 20 feet in front of the hood on the left side. It shifted its weight, a slow, careful adjustment from one foot to the other, not threatening, the kind of movement a person makes after standing still for a long time in cold air. Then, it settled again. The movement drew my eye to its size. It was the largest of the ones near the machine, and where the fog lay thinnest, I could see it clearly enough. The height was something above 7 feet, the build heavy in the chest and shoulders but not shapeless, the posture upright in the way that made you understand immediately why the word upright had always seemed insufficient. It stood the way a person stands, not the way any four-footed thing rearranges itself when forced briefly onto two legs, and the distinction was total and immediate, and it reached me in the gut before it reached me in the mind. I looked at the others. The ones nearest the cab were the largest. The ones deeper in the mist and toward the timber were smaller, and at the timber edge itself, nearly hidden in the standing trees, the shapes were smallest of all. That arrangement was not accidental. I could see that with enough clarity that I did not need to think about it in analytic terms. They had placed themselves in a pattern. The large ones nearest the machine, the smaller ones farther back, and at the boundary of the timber, the youngest. It was a formation that communicated something specific, and what it communicated was that this was an organized and intentional arrival. They had not gathered here the way animals gather at a water source or a kill. They had come here to this particular location and arranged themselves in this particular way with intention. I thought about the young one. I thought about its wrist and the cable and the sounds from the ridge that had been drawing closer while I worked the feral. I thought about the way the calls had changed character after the young one moved into the timber, the way the alarm note had dropped out and something softer had replaced it in the back and forth across the ridge. And I thought about the fact that at whatever hour during the night they had decided to come down from the ridge and stand around my machine, there had not been a sound that reached me through the cab wall. 40 of whatever these were, the smallest of them, still large beyond anything I could compare it to in my working experience with timber country animals, had moved through a cutover unit with deadfall and root systems and creek drainage and loose rock, and had arranged themselves within 20 feet of a parked skidder, in complete silence. I had been asleep. That is what I understood, sitting there in the cab with my cold thermos, watching the fog move between them in the early light. They had not woken me. They had come in quietly and arranged themselves around the machine and waited for me to come back to consciousness on my own. And then they had held position until I was awake enough to look up and see them. The patience in that was not the patience of animals waiting for a threat to recede. It was an older and more specific form of patience, the kind that says, I have something I need you to understand, and I will hold here until you are ready to receive it. I was 52 years old. I had worked the Kootenai for 23 years. I had spent more days alone. I was not a man who frightened easily or without reason, and I was not easily moved by things outside the range of the concrete and the measurable. And I sat in that cab and felt something move through me that I had no vocabulary for in the terms of my ordinary life. Not fear, not the particular awe I had sometimes felt standing in old-growth timber when the cathedral quality of the canopy pressed down on you and you understood that the structure around you had been building since before your great-great-grandfather was born. Something larger than both of those things and quieter. The quiet that underlies the loudest things. The quiet that was present in that drainage from the first morning I walked the north end of the unit and understood that I was not in an empty forest. After a time I reached forward and put my hand on the steering wheel. I am not certain why I did this. The machine was not running and I had no intention of starting it. But the familiar surface of the wheel was something that belonged to the category of my ordinary life. Smooth, worn rubber under my palms, and touching it seemed to help me remain in both places at once. The life I had led for 52 years, and the thing that was happening outside the glass. Gradually, as the sky continued to lighten, I became aware that some of the shapes in the fog were breathing in a way I could see. The cold morning air caught their breath and held it for a fraction of a second before it dispersed. Small horizontal plumes from the ones near enough to resolve clearly. The largest one in front of the hood was breathing steadily and without any sign of distress, its breath rising in small pulses. It had not moved again. None of them had moved since that first weight shift from the large one, and they showed no inclination to move, as if motion was simply not part of what they had come here to do. I do not know how long that arrangement held. Long enough that the light went from pewter to a pale gray gold as the sun began to lift above the ridge to the east. Long enough that I finished the cold coffee and set the thermos on the passenger seat and sat back with my arms on the wheel and my chin on my arms. looking through the windshield at the most improbable thing I had ever seen in Lincoln County, long enough that my body stopped producing any fight or flight signal, because the thing outside the glass was clearly not interested in anything that required either of those responses from me. When the first of them withdrew, it was the smallest, one of the ones at the timber edge that I had barely been able to resolve against the standing trees. It simply moved backward into the timber until the morning shadow absorbed it. A few seconds later, another of the small ones followed. Then, in no particular rush and with no signal I could detect, the withdrawal began to extend to the others, one or two at a time, moving toward the timber with that covered ground walking speed I had seen the night before. Fast without appearing fast, the geometry of the motion covering distance without the urgency that makes distance covering look like flight. They were not leaving because they were frightened. They were leaving because they had done what they came to do. The large one in front of the hood was among the last. It held position after most of the others had gone back into the standing timber, when only a handful remained visible in the mist, and the rest had been absorbed into the trees. It stood there looking at the cab for a span of time I felt in my sternum, and I held its look, and then it turned and walked toward the timber at the same unhurried pace as the others. At the edge of the cut, where the old standing timber began, it paused. This was the only pause any of them had made in the withdrawal. It stood there for a moment with its back to me, and then turned its head, not its whole body, and looked back at the cab over one shoulder. I cannot tell you what passed between us in that look. I have turned it over in my memory for 31 years, and I have not found language that fits it. Then it walked into the timber and was gone. I sat in the Skidder cab for a long time after that. The fog continued to move across the open ground. The cutover was empty, and the morning light was growing, and somewhere up on the ridge, a raven called once, and then was quiet. I started the timberjack. It was a normal sound in a normal morning in Lincoln County, Montana, diesel and hydraulics, and the warm-up vibration that I had lived beside for over a decade. I sat with it running, and I looked at the empty ground in front of the hood where the large one had been standing, and then I put the machine in gear and went to work. The morning after the gathering, I drove back to Troy on Forest Road 68 as the sun cleared the ridge and the larch on the upper slopes went bright gold in the first direct light. The road was empty, which it almost always was at that hour, and I had 45 minutes of driving in which to sit with what had happened since midnight and try to find the right size container for it. I had been in the Kootenai for 23 years. I had worked 51 timber sales on national forest land in Lincoln County. I had spent more nights sleeping in a truck cab on a logging road than I could count. And I had seen bear and moose and mountain lion and every other living thing that moves through that country by night and by day. And I had never once felt the impulse to question the category system I had been using for what lived in the Montana backcountry. That category system was now insufficient, and there was no updating it to fit what I had seen in the previous 12 hours. There was only accepting its insufficiency and deciding what to do next. What I decided to do next was to finish the contract. This sounds like a simple decision, and in some ways it was. I had a legal obligation to the federal government for the completion of a timber sale, and I had equipment in the field, and Vern Bressler's day rate wages to pay, and the mortgage on the house in Troy and the truck payments did not stop because of what I had seen in the dark. But the decision was also a considered choice about the relationship between what I now knew and what I had agreed to do before I knew it, and I want to be clear about what I settled on in that 45 minutes on the road. I was going to finish the sale that I had contracted for, in the boundaries that had been established before I started, because backing out of the contract would require an explanation I could not give and would accomplish nothing for the drainage anyway. But I was not going to bid on additional sales in the Yaak. That much had already decided itself before I reached the state highway. Shirley was at the table with coffee when I came in. She looked at my face and at the time on the clock on the wall and did not say anything for a moment. "Are you hurt?" she said. "No," I said. She poured me coffee and I sat down and she sat across from me, and I told her what had happened. Not everything yet. Not the accumulated weight of the whole fall, but the night itself, because the night was specific and concrete, and I could give it to her in the form of a sequence of events with a beginning and a middle and an end, which is the form a practical person can work with. The drive, the sounds from the ridge, the walk to the Snag field, what I had found there, the saw work, the wrist, the light in the young one's eyes, the feral working free, the walk back, the cab, the dawn, and the 40, standing in the cutover in the fog, and the large one in front of the hood, and the long withdrawal one by one into the standing timber, and the pause at the timber edge and the look over one shoulder. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The coffee cooled in my cup. Shirley had grown up in a logging family in Eureka and had heard stories from the timber her whole life. Stories from men who had spent their working lives in terrain that does not give up its inventory willingly, and she had the attitude toward those stories that most people who grow up around serious working men have, which is that you take what is concrete and set aside what is elaboration. What I was giving her was concrete. I had cut a tree with my chainsaw. I had worked a ferrule with my hands. The cable loop had come free from a wrist and the young one had moved into the timber, and 40 of them had stood in the fog around my machine in the morning light. These were actions and events I could describe with physical precision. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. She held it there for a moment. Then she said we should both get some sleep and we would talk more later. And that was the right thing to say, because what had happened in the past 12 hours needed to settle before either of us could think clearly about what it meant going forward. I slept for 4 hours. When I woke up, the house smelled like the soup Shirley made in November, thick with barley and the venison we put up in October, and I came down to the kitchen feeling like a man who had slept through an event and was now standing in the aftermath trying to get his bearings. Shirley was at the counter and she turned when she heard me on the stairs and she gave me the look that meant she had been thinking steadily while I was asleep and had some of it worked out. We sat down to soup and she asked me questions. Not the questions of someone who doubted what I had told her, but the questions of someone building a coherent picture from available information. How many times had she received the plant material I brought home before the night of the rescue? Whether I had been able to estimate the age of the young one in relation to the adults, what the exchanges at the lunchbox had felt like in terms of pattern and regularity, how the calls on the ridge had changed character in the period after the young one was freed. I answered everything I could, and what I could not answer precisely, I said I could not answer precisely, because with Shirley, precision about the limits of what I knew was always more useful than a well-intentioned approximation. By the end of that conversation, I understood something I had not been able to see clearly on my own. The exchanges at the lunchbox over the preceding weeks had been a form of calibration. Whatever was in the drainage had been establishing whether I was consistent, whether my behavior could be relied upon, whether the daily contact with the machine and the operation constituted a threat or simply a presence to be monitored. The plant material left in return was not accidental or incidental. It was a form of reciprocity that indicated the calibration had arrived at a conclusion. And the morning after the rescue, the 40 standing in the fog around the Skidder, was what a conclusion of that kind looked like when it was communicated in the only terms available to beings who did not share a language with a gyppo logger from Lincoln County. I had passed something. Before we get any further into this, I want to mention that a great deal of what I have been learning about this subject over the past several years went into a book I worked on with the channel. It is called The Bigfoot Codex. Everything I could not fit into a 30-minute video went in there, including what I came to understand about the exchanges in the Yaak and what I believe they indicate about how these beings operate in a shared landscape and how a person changes when they have had this kind of sustained contact and has to carry it back into an ordinary life. The link is below. Now, let us get back to the Yaak. I did not know what to call the test, and I did not need to call it anything. I just needed to understand that I had passed it. The days between the morning gathering and the end of the contract had a quality I have not experienced in any timber operation before or since. I was still doing the work. The skidder moved when it needed to move, and the turns came down the slope and the deck grew at the landing. Vern felled timber in his methodical and excellent way, and the steel ran clean, and the hydraulic lines on the timberjack held their pressure. All of that was unchanged, but the work was now happening inside a context that had expanded, and the expanded context changed the texture of every hour I spent on that unit. I was aware of the perimeter in a way I had not been before. Not anxiously, as a man is aware of the walls of a room where he knows other people are present but not visible. A structural awareness, background, and continuous. The standing timber at the edge of the cutover was not an abstract boundary to me anymore. It was the visible edge of a home range, of a territory that had its own interior logic and its own occupants, and I was working in the transitional zone between that territory and the forest road, and the occupants of that territory were watching the transition, and the man conducting it with intelligence I could not fully map, but could not dismiss. The exchanges at the lunchbox continued through the last 3 weeks of the contract. Every morning, I placed whatever I had brought, apples and dried fruit, and once a length of smoked trout I had caught in the Clark Fork the previous weekend, and every afternoon when I came back from the morning's turns, the food was gone, and the stone depression had something new in it. I began to think of these objects as a kind of correspondence, not in the sense of a human exchange of information, with the back and forth of shared language, more in the sense that two organisms in a shared landscape were establishing the fact of each other's presence and intention through the medium of what they left in a physical location. The plant material and the seeds and the woven fiber were not random. That was clear to me by this point. They were selected with the same consistency of attention that a person brings to the selection of a gift for someone they are beginning to understand. The selection reflected something about the relationship, what the giver knew about the recipient, what they thought the recipient could receive, what they were willing to offer as a demonstration of their own nature. I thought about this a great deal in the cab of the Skidder during those final weeks, in the quiet minutes when the hydraulics were cycling, and I had nothing immediate to attend to except keeping the machine on the skid trail grade. I thought about what I had given in return. Apples and dried fish, and the kind of food a working man carries in a lunchbox. Nothing I had left at the lunchbox had been selected with any of the intentionality that I was receiving. I had given food because food was what I had, and food seemed like an extension of the logic of the situation. But I had not thought about what the food communicated about my nature, about what kind of being brings apples to a logging operation in the Montana backcountry and leaves them beside his machine. After the morning gathering, I started thinking about it differently. I was leaving the same things I had always left, because the exchange had a pattern I did not want to disrupt, but I was leaving them with more awareness of what the act of leaving them meant. I was a man who had been given an experience outside any category I had and who had been trusted enough to come back and continue the work. And the least I could do was be fully present while I did it. The young one appeared again on the 9th day after the morning gathering. I had moved the skidder up to the second bench, a level section of the north end where the oldest larch on the unit stood, trees that the previous crews had measured at over 200 years, and I had just grappled a turn for the downhill when I looked up at the bench edge and there were 2 of them standing in the timber at the eastern margin. I recognized the young one immediately. The height, the width through the shoulders relative to the body length, the particular way it carried its weight. All of these were specific enough that I would have known it in a crowd. The other one was a great deal larger and stood with a stillness that was qualitatively different from the young one's stillness. As an adult stands differently from a young person, with a settled command of its own body that comes from having occupied that body for long enough that the occupation has become completely automatic. I set the grapple down and went back to work. This was a considered decision. I did not look at them for more than a few seconds at a stretch, and when I did, I kept my eyes moving rather than fixing on them directly, The same approach I had been using since the first week I noticed the ravens watching the ridge rather than the skidder. You do not stare at wild things you are trying not to frighten. You make your presence predictable and your attention diffuse, and you let them set the pace of any contact they are willing to allow. They stayed at the bench edge for close to 30 minutes. In that 30 minutes, I skidded one turn clear down to the landing and was coming back up the skid trail when I crested the bench and found them still there. The young one now a few steps closer to the open ground and the large one behind it. When I saw the position had changed, I kept the skidder moving at its normal pace and went back to the next turn as if what was standing at the bench edge were no more significant than the standing timber behind it. I do not know what calculation this registered in whatever the large one was running. I only know that when I looked up after completing the grappling sequence for the next turn, the bench edge was empty. That evening, when I came back to the landing to shut down and load the last haul, I found the stone depression full of something I had not encountered in the previous exchanges. Not plant material, not seeds. A piece of material that was clearly not natural. Not anything that the forest produces. It was a length of braided fiber, but braided with a complexity that went beyond the simple spiral I had received previously. A flat braid about 4 inches wide and 8 inches long. The strands twisted and crossed in a consistent pattern. The fiber itself was something I could not identify. Not bark and not root. Something processed into a more refined form than raw plant material. I held it in both hands in the cab on the drive home and tried to understand what I was holding and what the receiving of it meant. And by the time I reached the state highway, I had arrived only at the conclusion that it was the most specific thing I had received in the entire duration of the exchange, and that its specificity was intentional. I kept working, as I always had, and the days shortened toward November, and the larch on the upper slopes went from gold to bare, and the temperature on the upper bench dropped into the low 20s by mid-morning. The timberjack ran well in the cold. Vern came up at the agreed-upon time, and we fell into our working rhythm without difficulty. And the north end of the unit came down steadily as the second half of October moved toward its close. The drainage was occupied, consistently and without exception, throughout those remaining weeks. What had changed was the character of the occupation, the way the attention felt against the skin of a man who has learned to pay it the right kind of attention in return. Something had been established that had not been established in September. The exchange had happened in both directions, over a period of 3 months, and what remained was its result. Over the following week, I fell into a new rhythm on the unit. The work was the same, Vern cutting and I skidding, the haul road running twice a day when the loads were right, the slash building for the burn contract that would come after my timber sale closed. The north end of the unit was no less occupied than it had been before the morning of the gathering. The ravens were still working the ridge. The quality of presence I had been feeling since the first days on the north end was as strong and specific as it had ever been. But what it was communicating had changed. Before the night in the Snag field, the presence had the character of wariness, an intelligence tracking an unfamiliar variable and not yet having established what to make of it. After the morning gathering, it had the character of something more settled. Not warm, exactly, and not indifferent. Something between those two things, as a long-established coexistence feels, between neighbors who have lived beside each other long enough that the relationship has found its natural level without ever requiring them to shake hands. I kept leaving food at the lunchbox. That felt like the right thing to maintain. The thread of the pattern that had been established. The exchanges continued, though the character of what came back changed. The plant material became more varied. Things I had not seen in the earlier exchanges. Bark from trees I could not identify. A feather I found pressed into the stone depression that Shirley later identified as possibly from a great gray owl. Twice, in that last week of October, I came back to the lunchbox to find small objects that were not plant material at all. The first was a smooth river stone, rounded by water, with a surface texture unlike any rock formation I could place in the Yaak drainage geology. The second was a length of root fiber woven into a tight spiral, like a coil of rope scaled down to finger thickness, 12 or 15 inches long. Shirley added both of these to the cloth bag without comment, with the same care she gave to everything that passed through her hands. Vern Bressler's arrival changed the energy of the unit in ways I had not anticipated. This was not Vern's fault. He was the same man he had always been, a focused and skilled timber faller who brought his attention to the work and did not involve himself in things that were outside his professional scope. But the presence of a second person in the unit altered the calibration in some way I could not precisely describe. The exchanges at the lunchbox stopped the day Vern arrived and did not resume. The quality of the attention from the north end shifted back toward the wariness register I had felt in September. Less settled, more tracking. I told myself this was appropriate. The drainage had spent 3 months calibrating one person. The introduction of a second person required the process to reset to some degree, and 10 days was not enough time for a new calibration to complete. What I did not anticipate was the degree to which Vern's presence seemed to be tracked at a closer level than mine had been. I became aware of this in specific ways. The ravens that had been distributed across the unit would concentrate on the section where Vern was working, rather than the section where I was running the skidder, which was the opposite of their previous behavior. The structures near the creek were not disturbed, but twice in the last 10 days of the sale I found what appeared to be fresh prints in the soft ground between where Vern had been falling and where the trail came down to the landing, closer to the center of the operation than any prints I had found before Vern arrived. Whatever was in the drainage was conducting its own assessment of the new person, and it was doing it more directly than it had done with me. Vern noticed nothing that he mentioned. The conversation Vern and I had, the one that consisted of him saying "big" and me saying "yes," was the entirety of our verbal engagement with the subject for the 10 days we worked together. But on the last day, after we had finished the final section of the north end and were loading Vern's tools into his truck at the landing, he stopped with a tool bag in each hand and looked up at the ridge. He stood there for a moment. "Don't bid on the ridge sale if they offer it," he said. I looked at him. "Just a thought," he said, and loaded his bags and got in his truck and drove away. I have not seen Vern since that morning. He moved to Libby the following year, and I heard he took a faller's job on a different district and worked it until his back gave out somewhere in his late 60s. I hope he is well. He was a good man to work beside. And the fact that he said what he said on that last morning, without explaining what he meant or asking me to confirm or deny anything, tells me more about the quality of his judgment than anything else I knew about him in 20-some years. The Forest Service letter about the ridge sale arrived at the house in Troy in early December. I was sitting at the kitchen table going through the receipts from the fall season when the mail came, and I set the rest of the mail aside and read the letter twice and then put it on the table in front of me and sat there with my coffee getting cold. The unit being offered was 400 acres on the ridgeline directly above the north end of the sale I had just closed, and the cruise figures were strong, old-growth larch and grand fir on ground that the logging roads could access from 2 directions. On paper, it was the best individual timber sale that had come out of the Troy Ranger District in several years. I thought about the morning gathering. I thought about the 40 standing in the fog with their breath rising in small, cold plumes in the gray light, and about the large one at the timber edge, pausing before it went back into the trees, and about the way the drainage had felt different from the south end of the unit from the first morning I walked it. I thought about what a 400-acre harvest on the ridge above the drainage would do to the structure of that place. The root systems and the canopy and the snag resource and the creek chemistry and everything else that made the north end of the Yaak unit into the place it was. Not in abstract ecological terms, though those were real enough. In the specific terms of what I had learned over the course of the fall about what was living in that ridge system and how it used the old growth and the creek drainages and the snag fields, and what it would mean for those beings to have that structure torn up and hauled out by a gyppo logger with a timberjack and a Peterbilt. Shirley had been watching me read the letter from across the table where she was going through the household accounts. When I put the letter down, she picked it up and read it herself. She set it down. That ridge is their home, she said. She had arrived at this conclusion, as I said, with the same logic I had been working through since December when the letter arrived. I had told her enough over the fall that she understood the geography, the drainage, the ridge, the relationship between the north end of the sail I had just closed and the ridgeline above it. She understood that the ridge sail would mean another contractor going into the exact system where the gathering had been assembled, where the structures were, where the exchange had been conducted over 3 months, where the young one had been caught in the snag field. She understood this without my having to map it for her, because Shirley always understood the geography of a situation before I did. Then we don't log it, she said, and went back to the household accounts. I called Curtis Drake at the Troy Ranger District the following Monday and withdrew my bid. Curtis asked if there was a problem with the crew's estimate, because a withdrawal at that stage was unusual enough that there was typically a reason. I told him I had a commitment on another unit that would conflict with the spring start date for the ridge sail. This was not true, but it was the kind of reason that requires no follow-up questions. And Curtis took it at face value and said he would note the withdrawal and the sail would go back out. I thanked him and hung up. The conversation with Shirley in which I told her the full weight of the fall was not the conversation I had expected to have. I had been carrying the accumulated experience of 3 months in the Yaak drainage since September, and I had given Shirley pieces of it as they came. The plant material from the lunchbox exchanges, the track measurements, the night of the rescue, the morning of the gathering, but I had not given her the whole shape of it, the total structure of what I had been inside for the past several months, and the Forest Service letter about the ridge sail was the occasion for giving it to her, because the ridge sail was the point at which what I knew was going to have to determine what I did, and I could not make that determination honestly without first being honest about the full scope of the knowledge. We sat at the kitchen table in December with the ridge sail letter between us on the table, and I went back to September. I told her about the first morning I walked the north end of the unit and felt its quality of presence, and about the ravens and what the ravens had been doing for 3 months, and about the track behind the Skidder tire and what my size 11 boot looked like inside it. I told her about the structures at the creek, the bent saplings and the interlocked tops, and the floor of arranged limbs I had found near the northern end of the cutover. I told her about the smell, the specific character of it, and how it came alongside the quality of presence rather than preceding it, how a person's smell arrives with them rather than announcing them. I told her about the weeks of exchange at the lunchbox, all of it, every piece of plant material and seed arrangement and the woven fiber braid, and about what I had come to understand about the logic of the exchange and what it communicated in both directions. I told her about the calls from the ridge over the entire duration of the fall, the 3-source pattern in the early evenings, how the call pattern had changed after the night in the snag field. I told her about the subsequent changes in the behavior of the elk and the deer and what that behavior indicated about the range structure of whatever was occupying the north end. I told her about the day the young one and the large adult stood at the bench edge for 30 minutes while I worked the skidder, and about the braided fiber I had received that evening, and about how the exchange had shifted in character after the morning of the gathering, from the earlier wariness calibration to something more settled. And then I told her what I had not fully told her before, which was what the morning of the gathering had meant to me when I sat with it in the cab with the 40 standing in the fog around the machine, not what it had looked like, which I had described, what it had meant. What a man understands when an intelligence that has spent an entire season determining whether he can be trusted comes down from the ridge in the dark and assembles itself around his machine and waits in the cold for him to wake up and look at it. What it feels like to be on the receiving end of that kind of accounting. To understand that you have been evaluated by something with the patience and the perceptual apparatus to conduct that kind of evaluation, and that the evaluation has come out in your favor, and that you are being told so in the only language available to beings who share no other form of communication with you. I told her that I had sat in that cab with 40 of them in the fog, and I had felt something I had never felt in my 52 years of ordinary life in Lincoln County. and that the closest I could come to naming it was to say that I had been seen, fully and without any of the protective distortion that human seeing allows, and that the experience of being seen in that way had changed something in me that I could not change back. Shirley listened to all of this, as she listened to everything I gave her, without interrupting and without the face of a person who is managing their response. When I finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, "That ridge is their home." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "We don't log it." And that was the conversation. But I want to say something about the conversation beyond its content, because the content is not what mattered most about it. What mattered was that I had been carrying those 3 months in a form of solitary custody for the entire duration of the fall, and Shirley had received what I gave her without setting any of it down. She took the whole thing and held it alongside me in the way she had always held the things that mattered in our marriage, not by agreeing with everything I said or by endorsing every conclusion I had come to, but by taking the experience seriously as an experience, by treating the fact that it had happened to me as sufficient reason to take it seriously, by being the person who received my testimony and added her intelligence to it rather than her skepticism. That is what a good marriage does with the things that cannot be explained in the vocabulary of an ordinary life. It makes room for them. It holds them without requiring them to be other than they are. Shirley was very good at that. She was better at it than I was. And I say that knowing the irony that I was the one who had been in the snag field. I called Curtis Drake on Monday morning and withdrew the bid. He asked if there was a scheduling conflict, and I said yes. He noted the withdrawal and said the sale would go back out and thanked me for letting them know promptly. The whole conversation lasted 4 minutes. The 4 minutes in which I closed the door on the most financially significant timber sale I had been offered in 5 years felt shorter than 4 minutes, and simpler. And I was glad of the simplicity. Driving back from the phone call, I thought about Vern Bressler at the landing on the last day, saying don't bid on the ridge sale, and about the way he had said it, without looking at me and without waiting for a response, putting it into the air and getting in his truck and going. I thought about what it meant that Vern had arrived at the same conclusion I had through 10 days in the north end of the unit, without the accumulated context of the whole fall, without the night in the snag field or the morning of the gathering. Vern was a man who had been reading timber country for 40 years and whose reading was almost never wrong, and what he had read in 10 days in the north end of the Yaak unit was enough for him. That told me something about the legibility of the place to someone who knew how to read it. And it told me something about Vern, which I had already known but was glad to have confirmed. The sale went to Gary Hedrick out of Libby. Gary was a reliable contractor with a solid reputation on the Kootenai, and I had no reason to believe the ridge sale would go any differently than any other unit he had successfully completed over his career. I want to be fair to Gary in this account. He had no information I had, and he accepted the contract in good faith and went to work in April of '93 with no reason to expect anything other than a standard National Forest timber harvest in the Kootenai. Whatever happened to his operation in the spring and early summer of that year, whatever it was that sheared his hydraulic lines at the fittings and laid green timber across his primary skid trail overnight and produced circumstances unusual enough that his faller quit without explanation after 3 weeks, Gary Hedrick did not deserve that. He was doing his job in good faith, and the drainage did not distinguish between the contractor who had stood in its fog at dawn and the one who had not. I understood this and I was sorry for it, and I was also aware that there was no action I could have taken that would have prevented it, short of buying the timber sale myself and holding it unlogged, which was not within my financial means. What I could do was not add to the disturbance. That much was within my means, and I did it. In the fall of 1993, when I was working a Cabinet Mountains unit north of Libby, I went through a period of about 3 weeks in which the experience in the Yaak resisted integration in a way it had not done before. Not the facts of it. The facts were stable and accessible, and I had no doubt about them. What resisted integration was the consequences. The specific understanding that my relationship to the landscape I had worked for 23 years had changed in a way I could not change back, and that the change carried obligations I had not chosen and could not set aside. I had not chosen to go into the Snag field. I had not chosen the young one to be there, or the cable to be around its wrist, or myself to have a saw in my hand. But I had made the choices that followed from those unchosen facts. And the choices had consequences, and one of the consequences was that the landscape I was now working in was different to me than the landscape I had been working in before the fall of '92. By different, I do not mean frightening or overwhelming or transformed into something alien. I mean that my relationship to it had gained a layer that had not been there before. Every timber unit I worked after the Yaak sale, I was working in country that might contain what the Yaak contained, and while I could not know whether any specific drainage or ridgeline was occupied in the way the Yaak was occupied, I could not operate on the assumption that it was not. The assumption of emptiness that I had carried into every timber unit before the Yaak sale was no longer available to me. The Kootenai National Forest was not empty. It contained something I had looked at from 4 feet away in the light of a headlamp. And whatever percentage of the forest it occupied, and whatever its distribution across the drainage systems I had worked, the emptiness assumption was gone and I could not get it back. I want to be specific about what this changed in practical terms, because I am a practical man and I want to give you the practical version. It changed how I walked in the timber. Before the Yaak, I walked in the timber the way a man who has been comfortable in the woods for 23 years walks, purposeful and attentive to what I needed to attend to, which was the ground surface and the overhead danger zones and the sound of the saw and the skidder, and not attendant to the larger environment in any sustained way beyond what the job required. After the Yaak, I walked in the timber differently, not with fear, with what I would call widened attention, an extension of the peripheral register I was giving to the landscape beyond the operational boundary of the job. I noticed things I had not noticed before, or had noticed without retaining. The specific shifts in bird behavior that precede a large predator's movement through a sector, the quality of quiet that means the ambient life of a forest has registered something that requires recalibration. I had been reading these signals for 23 years without understanding that they could be telling me something my category system had no category for. After the Yaak, I understood that the signals might be telling me that, and I paid attention to them as if they might. Did I encounter anything in the 9 years between the Yaak sale and my retirement that I would describe as related to what I had experienced in the Yaak? I have thought about this question carefully, because the answer to it matters, and I want to give you the honest version rather than the version that confirms a narrative. The answer is possibly once, and I am not certain enough to claim more than the possibility. In the fall of 1998, I was working a unit in the Bull River country, north of Libby, in a drainage I had worked twice before without anything unusual. October, late in the month, the larch already bare and the temperature dropping fast. I was on the Skidder, skidding a turn down to the landing in the late afternoon when the quality of the forest around me changed in the specific way I had learned in the Yaak. Not alarmed. The occupied version, the settled attention on you version. I brought the Skidder to a stop and sat in the cab and let the feeling develop the way you let a sound develop when you are trying to isolate it from background noise. And it was what it was. The distinctive character of a specific kind of presence, directed at the machine from somewhere in the standing timber to the northeast, held for about 4 minutes, and then gone. I did not find a track. I did not find a structure. I did not find anything I could point to in evidentiary terms. What I found was 4 minutes of that specific quality of attention, and a raven that went silent on a snag top at the edge of the cut, and faced the northeast for the duration of the 4 minutes and then resumed its ordinary behavior when the quality of the forest returned to its baseline. I sat in the cab for a while after it passed, and then I went back to work and I drove home to Troy and I told Shirley about it over supper. She listened, and then she said, "They move around." That was all she said about it. She was right, in the way she was usually right, about the things that required the most accuracy. The Yaak was not a closed system. The drainage was part of a larger landscape, connected to the other drainages of the Kootenai through the corridor of old growth and the ridge systems and the seasonal movements of everything that uses the timber country. Whatever I had spent a fall in contact with in the Yaak was not confined to the Yaak. The Yaak was where one particular relationship had established itself. The wider landscape was what it was, regardless of whether any particular relationship had been established in it. That was a clarifying thing to understand. I kept working. The Bull River unit closed clean. I moved to the next sale. The falls went by. In the years between the Yaak sale and my retirement from contracting in 2001, I worked a total of 17 more timber sales on the Kootenai National Forest. I did good work on all of them and closed them clean and had no serious disputes with the Forest Service over contract compliance, which in the timber contracting business is the equivalent of a clean record. What I did not do was bid any sale in the Yaak drainage or within the Bull River country north of the Yaak River divide, which I had come to understand as the lower bound of whatever territory I was committed to, not logging further. The Kootenai is a large forest, and there was plenty of timber outside those boundaries to keep me in operation for 9 more years. And nobody in the contracting community noticed the gap in my bidding geography because a gyppo logger's decisions about which sales to bid on are private and numerous, and the pool of potential sales in the district is large enough that any individual contractor leaves gaps. The 9 years between the Yaak sale and retirement had a character that was different from the 23 years before it. This was not entirely about the Yaak. A man at 52, working in his body as timber work requires, is already aware of the accumulation of physical consequence in his joints and his back and his hands in a way he was not aware of at 35. The knees in particular. I had been getting in and out of a Skidder cab for 23 years, and the knees were telling me, with increasing specificity through the mid-90s, that the account was coming due. The work was still good, and I was still capable of doing it. But the cost of doing it was higher than it had been, and the margin between the cost and what the work returned was contracting in ways that I could see even when I did not want to see them. What was different in those 9 years that was about the Yaak was the way I carried what had happened there. I had expected the experience to recede with time, as experiences do when they are no longer present. Instead, it settled. It became part of the bedrock of what I knew, alongside the feel of a tight skid trail grade and the sound a hydraulic line makes when it is about to fail. Not dominant, not something I was thinking about every day, but present in the way that any true thing is present, available whenever the conditions of the moment made it relevant, surfacing on the drives into the woods in the fall, when the larch went gold and the air had that particular Kootenai October quality that I have not experienced anywhere else and could not adequately describe to anyone who has not been inside it. I thought about the exchange at the lunchbox more than I thought about any other specific element of the fall. Not the dramatic elements. The night in the Snag field. The morning of the gathering. Those were easier to hold in memory because they had the quality of events, with a before and an after and a shape that memory could retain. The exchange at the lunchbox was harder to hold exactly because it was cumulative, because it existed in the texture of the week rather than the structure of the events, and what it indicated was harder to summarize. But what it indicated was this: that the beings in that drainage had developed, over the course of 3 months, a working model of Roy Caudill's behavior and intentions, and that working model had been accurate enough to allow them to conclude something about whether I was a threat. They had done this through repeated observation, and through the medium of an exchange that I had not initiated but that I had sustained once it began. And the conclusion they had arrived at had been communicated in a form that left me no room for misunderstanding. The morning of the 40 was a verdict, in the same way that a judicial verdict is a verdict. A formal statement, made by an authority competent to make it, of what the evidence has established. Shirley and I drove to the Yaak in most falls between 93 and 2015. The visits had no agenda beyond presence. We went to the drainage, walked the skid trail as far as the regrowth allowed, stood at the edge of the old cutover in the October light, and then drove back to Troy. We did not try to recreate the conditions of any specific previous experience. We did not call into the drainage or leave food or attempt any form of contact. We simply went back to the place the way a person goes back to the place where something important happened, not to recover the event but to acknowledge its place in the geography of a life. The drainage received our visits the way the drainage received everything, without comment, but with the specific quality of attention that had been its signature from the first morning. I walked the north end of the unit. I want to describe what those visits felt like across 20-odd years, because the feeling changed, and the change was significant. In the first years after the sale, through the mid-90s, the visits had an urgency to them. The urgency of a person who is still in the process of integrating a large experience, and who returns to its location because returning is part of the integration. I needed to go back to the Yaak the way you sometimes need to go back to a physical place to confirm that what happened there was real, that the specific arrangement of trees and ground and creek and ridge that framed the experience is still there and still has the character it had when you were inside it. The drainage always confirmed this. It was always what it had been, and the confirmation was always good and necessary. By the early 2000s, the urgency had faded into something more like habit, in the best sense of the word, a practice, maintained because its maintenance was right, not because it was resolving anything that remained unresolved. By then, the experience in the Yaak had fully integrated into the structure of what I knew, and returning to the drainage was not about completion but about acknowledgement. The Yaak was part of my interior geography, alongside the house in Troy and the mill scales in Libby and the sound of the Clark Fork in October and the face of every man I had worked beside in 30 years of timber country. I went back because not going back would have been a form of forgetting. And forgetting what happened in that drainage would have been the wrong relationship to the thing that had been given to me. In the fall of 2006, on a visit that Shirley and I made in early October, when the larch was still fully gold on the upper slopes, we spent a longer time than usual at the bench edge at the top of the old skid trail. The regrowth on the bench was dense enough by then that we were not standing in open ground. We were at the edge of an alder thicket that had been open cut over 14 years before, and the standing timber behind it was the undisturbed old growth of the north end that had never been part of the sale. We had been standing there for about 40 minutes, Shirley beside me with her hands in her coat pockets and the small camera in her outside pocket, when the forest went through the shift in texture and attention I had learned to read in the fall of '92. Not alarmed. The settled version, the version that meant the drainage had registered our presence and had concluded what it usually concluded when we came back. Shirley heard it before I did. She put her hand on my arm and I went still. From somewhere up the drainage, maybe 200 yards, came a vocalization I had not heard since the night in the Snag field. Not the lower calls, not the complex back and forth of the ridge, the sound that the young one had made in the distress of the cable, but without the distress, the higher register sound in a form that had no urgency in it, sustained for about 4 seconds, and then silence. Shirley gripped my arm harder. Neither of us moved. Then the forest went back to its ordinary October sounds, wind in the fir in the creek and a raven somewhere on the ridge, and we stood there for another few minutes before we walked back down to the truck. On the drive down, she said, "It told us it was there." I thought about that on the drive back to Troy and for a long time afterward. The sound was specific and it was unprompted, and it came from the north end of the drainage where the old growth stood undisturbed, and it was the only vocalization I had heard on any of our return visits over 14 years. I do not know what to call what it communicated. Shirley's characterization is as good as any I have come up with. I drove back to Troy that evening thinking about the 4-second sound and about what it would have taken for the being that made it to step into the range of our observation and produce something so specifically directed at us. We had been standing at the bench edge for 40 minutes. Whatever was in the drainage had been aware of our presence throughout those 40 minutes. It had the option of remaining entirely silent, as it had remained entirely silent on every previous visit except the year Shirley saw the figure step into the open. Something in the configuration of that particular October afternoon had produced a different response, and the response had been a sound with a quality I recognized, and that Shirley, who had never been in the Snag field and had never heard anything like the calls from the ridge that I had heard all fall in '92, recognized instantly as intentional and directed. That is not a small thing. That is a form of communication between two very different kinds of beings, mediated by sound, across a gap of 60 years of my accumulated misunderstanding of what was in the Kootenai. I thought about it the whole drive home, and I am still thinking about it now. For the 9 years I continued to work timber in the Kootenai after the Yaak sale, I worked the Cabinet Mountains and the Bull River drainage and the country north of Libby, and I did good work and closed my contracts clean and kept my equipment maintained and paid Vern's day rate whenever he was available. The Kootenai is a large forest, and there was enough timber outside the Yaak drainage to keep me operating without returning to the specific system I had committed to leaving alone. Nobody in the contracting community noticed or asked about it, because a gyppo logger's decisions about which sales to bid are private and numerous, and nobody tracks them from the outside. I retired from contracting in 2001. The knees and the equipment costs and the federal timber sales schedule, which had been contracting since the early '90s as the Spotted Owl litigation worked through the courts, all combined in that year to make the arithmetic of continuing no longer viable. I sold the Timberjack to a contractor in Eureka and the Peterbilt to a dealer in Kalispell, and paid off the equipment loans and kept what remained in a savings account that Shirley managed with her characteristic precision. We were not wealthy. We were comfortable in the way that working people in Lincoln County are comfortable when they have lived carefully for 25 years and kept the house maintained and put the children through school without debt. Shirley and I made the drive to the Yaak drainage most falls between '93 and 2015. Not every year, but more years than not. I have described the first visit in October of '93 and Shirley's sighting at the timber edge. The subsequent visits did not produce anything that unambiguous. The sightings in the timber country sense of the word, specific close views of a clear subject in decent light, were rare, and after Shirley's '93 sighting I did not have another that I would describe in those terms. What I had were the other things that the drainage always provided when I came back to it. The quality of presence in the north end, the raven behavior, the call and response that sometimes came from the ridge in the early evening if we were in the cutover late enough. Twice more we found structures at the creek, one of them substantially larger than anything I had seen during the sale, an arch of bent saplings that spanned the creek itself, the interlock tops 15 feet above the water. Shirley photographed it with the small camera she always carried on those trips. Shirley's health changed in the summer of 2018. That is when the scan found what it found, and that is when the oncologist in Kalispell told us in the clear and direct way he was obligated to be clear and direct what we were dealing with and what the timeline most likely looked like. I have been in Lincoln County my entire life, and Lincoln County is not a county where people are theatrical about terminal illness. The response to that kind of news in a place like Troy is the same response you bring to any other large problem that has announced itself and requires your full working attention. You find out what you know and what you can do about what you know, and you do it, and you let the rest of it be what it is going to be. Shirley managed her illness the way she managed everything in our life together, with precision and without unnecessary comment, and I did what needed doing in the house and at the appointments and at the practical business of the situation, and our children came when they could, and the neighbors on the county road brought meals and checked in, and that was the community we lived in. In late November of 2018, when the cold had come in for real and the mountains were snow-covered and the Kootenai was running slate gray in the short light, Shirley asked me to take her up to the Yaak one more time. She had not asked before this. She was moving less easily by then, and the drive to the Yaak required an hour on the state highway and then the forest road, and I had not suggested it because I was not certain she was well enough for the journey. But she asked, on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and I said we could go the following day if the weather held. The weather held. We went up on a Wednesday. The larch had been bare since October, and the drainage had the lean, late November look, all vertical line and shadow, and the pale standing timber on the upper slopes. I drove to the end of the haul road, and she said she did not need to get out, that sitting and looking at the ridge was enough. We sat in the truck with the engine running for the heat, and she looked at the ridge through the windshield with the attention she had always given to the things that mattered to her, and I sat beside her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. After about an hour, she said she was ready to go, and I turned the truck around and drove back down Forest Road 68. On the state highway, she said, "I am glad we came the first time," meaning October of '93, when she had stood at the timber edge and seen the figure step into the open. I said I was glad too. She put her hand on my arm, and I drove the rest of the way to Troy with her hand on my arm and the mountains going dark above the valley. She died in March. The 8 months between the diagnosis and the end contained everything that the final months of a long life together contain. And I will not try to summarize them except to say that Shirley was present for all of it, fully herself and fully there, until very close to the end. She was 71 years old, and she had been in Lincoln County for all of them except a handful of trips, and she knew the shape of the landscape around Troy the way you know the shape of a face you have been looking at every day for most of your life, from every angle and in every light. The house in Troy has been mine alone since March of 2019, and I have been in it through 6 winters and 6 springs since then. And what I can tell you about living alone in a house where someone lived for 44 years is that it does not become ordinary. You make accommodations. You learn the rhythms of your own company, and you find the parts of the day that are manageable, and you work around the parts that are not. And you keep the house the way you kept it together because keeping it is the right thing to do, and because the alternative is a decline that would have made Shirley impatient. I keep the house. I call Dale on Sundays, and Gail comes over from the Flathead, and the neighbors on the county road wave from their trucks. The days pass. This is the shape of things, and I have made my peace with the shape. What I want to say about the 6 years since Shirley died, in the context of this story, is that the Yaak has remained available to me in the way it has always been available since the fall of '92. Not as a consolation, because the Yaak is not a consolation and it was not designed for the purpose, but as a thing that is true and that has not changed, in a period when a great deal has changed. The exchange in the Snag field and the morning of the gathering and the 30 years of return visits and the sound from the north end in 2006 are as real now as they were when they happened, and they do not recede. The things that are genuinely true do not recede. They settle deeper into whatever substrate of the mind holds the material that a life is made of, and they remain there, accessible when the conditions of the moment make them accessible. The trip in October of 2022 was the most recent time I have been to the drainage, 30 years from the fall of the sale. I have described what I found at the Snag field and at the old stump, and I have described what I thought about standing there in the afternoon light with the larch needles coming down around me. I want to add only this, that when I turned away from the stump and walked back toward the skid trail, I paused at the edge of the regrowth and looked up at the ridge for a few minutes, the way Shirley and I had always paused there when we visited together. The ridge was in shadow by then, the sun behind the upper slope, the timber dark at the crest. I stood there long enough that my eyes adjusted to the lower light at the ridgeline. Then I turned and walked back to the truck. The road down from the Yaak to the state highway follows the West Fork to the valley, and then the Yaak River to the highway junction. And in the late October afternoon light, the country along that road is as clean and specific as anything in Lincoln County. I drove it at the pace I have always driven it, which is the pace of someone who knows the road and is not in a hurry and wants to keep all of what is outside the windshield visible for the duration of the drive. The cottonwoods were bare by then, the larch already down, the creek running clear and cold between the alder and the willow on the banks. A Lincoln County October afternoon, which I have been inside for 72 of them now, and which I will be inside for whatever number of them remain to me. What I have been given, in the course of this story, is the knowledge that the Kootenai National Forest contains more than the Forest Service's cruise data accounts for. This is not a complaint about the Forest Service, which is an institution that operates within the limits of what it is authorized to acknowledge, and what it is authorized to acknowledge is determined by the same institutional logic that made Curtis Drake write Black Bear in his field notes when he was standing over a print that no bear made. The limits of institutional acknowledgement are not the limits of the world. I have known this since October of 1992, when I sat in a Skidder cab in the fog and counted 40 of them standing in the cutover around my machine, patient and enormous, and watching the man in the glass with an intelligence I could not measure and could not question and could not look away from. I am 72 years old and I live in Lincoln County, and I have always lived here, and the Yaak River drainage is part of what this county is. It is part of what this country is, not the country of borders and maps and administrative designations, but the country that predates those things by enough time that the things themselves become very small when you think about them in the right perspective. Something lives in those mountains that has been living there long enough that the logging roads and the timber sale schedules and the Forest Service district boundaries are recent events, are passing things, are the briefest layer of change laid over a landscape that does not measure time the way we measure it. I know this because I spent a fall in the Yaak working alongside it, and it looked at me from 4 feet away with eyes that contained more than I had been taught to expect from anything in the timber country, and then it stood up and went into the trees and left me in the snag field with my dead saw and my changed life and everything that came after. I have been asked, in the years since I began telling this story to people I trust, whether I believe that what happened in the Yaak drainage changed what I think happens to a person after they die. I do not know how to answer that question with the kind of precision I prefer. What I can say is that spending a fall in sustained proximity to a form of intelligence that has been in these mountains for longer than any institution I have dealt with in my lifetime, and that has managed to remain present and coherent and apparently functional across the entire span of documented human activity in Lincoln County, makes the human category of finite and terminal feel like a more provisional designation than it did before. Not false, provisional. The timber country in Lincoln County in October holds more than the cruise estimates. I knew that from the fall of '92, and I have not been able to unknow it, and I do not try anymore. The old snag is returning to the earth, the way all timber returns when it has stood long enough and come to rest on ground that is ready to receive it. The cable is still around the stump, oxidized now to the color of the larch bark around it, returning in its own way. The drainage is still occupied, in the way it has been occupied since before any road was cut to it, or any tree was sold from it. And every fall, when the larch goes gold in Lincoln County and the light comes through at that particular angle that I have never been able to describe to anyone's satisfaction, something in me that has been part of my interior since October of 1992 turns toward the Yaak River drainage the way a compass turns toward north. It is not a choice. It is not a sentiment. It is not something I constructed from the materials of what I wanted to believe. It is what is true and has been true for 31 years. You do not argue with what is true. You hold it as carefully as you can for as long as you have, and when the time comes to pass it on, you find the words you have and give them to whoever is ready to receive them. You have been ready. I am grateful for that. So was she, and so was the drainage that held us both.